Church, it is good to be home. You have been missed and thought about and prayed for and laughed with and cried over, and I thought you might have things be a little warmer this morning, but there are a couple new changes, a couple faces I don't recognize, and that's great. And a couple little faces that were here incognito before that are now with us in another form. How good God is. I want to share with you this morning some things on the thoughts. I sent this slide among a couple, and I asked if we could have it up there just to look. This morning's theme is Easter theme. And I want to take it from a little different perspective this morning, and we're going to talk about what makes the tomb special. And what makes the tomb special is that it is empty. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Israel and walk in that area. You know, if I were to take you to Israel this morning, there are two spots that I can take you to where Jesus was born, and two spots where he was crucified, and two spots where he was buried, because they don't know. But the thing that's interesting, just outside of the city walls is a place called Gordon's Calvary, and Gordon was an English soldier, and in the 30s and 40s that was stationed there in Palestine, as it was known then. And he came across this particular archaeological dig site, and it's just outside of the city walls. And it's really interesting. Today, there's a small highway above the tomb area, the garden tomb, as it's called. It's just outside of a city bus station in Jerusalem. And the diesel buses come through, and they stink, and they belch, and it's ugly. And there's commotion going on. And I thought how reasonable to assume that even in those days, and we're going to read about them in a few moments, when they took Jesus, and you know the story. I'm not telling you a story this morning that no one's heard before. You've heard it. We're going to think about it in a little different way. But they took him and they crucified him. And the thought was, done, buried, dead, gone, and that's it. We're done with it. Finally we can put this Jesus character to rest. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, as we know. And what began at Christmas time, remember back in December, now comes to fruition today as we think about Easter. Next week, by the way, and this is a little plug for that, we're kind of taking it a little out of sequence, but it's fine. Next week we will gather for communion, and we will remember the transitional event that goes from the bookends. Really, the scriptures are bookends. They begin with Bethlehem, and they end with Calvary, and in the middle is the highlight of it. So I invite you and encourage you between now and next week to give some thoughts. And again, most of you at that point, this will not be the first time you've taken communion. This will not be the first time you've thought about it. But I would like you to think about it as if it were the first time. And to make it a personal kind of time. That tomb is empty for you and for me. And he gave his life, as we will celebrate next week, so that we might have a reason to say, as Doug tried to get you to do this morning, he is risen. He is risen indeed. Indeed. Let me share with you this morning, as I come to the stairs again, let me just share a couple thoughts. In Matthew's gospel, we read this, and I had I had Laura included in the program. It's in the bulletin. I think it's probably going to come up on the screen as well. But Matthew has an interesting take on the resurrection experience. And I'm going to read for you Matthew 28, the first 15 verses. And I'll point out a couple thoughts that are there, and then we'll think about a couple of those as we think about, is there a resurrection in your life and in my life? And it gathers around the theme this morning of the empty tomb. Matthew 28, first 15 verses, records and reads as follows. After the Sabbath, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. And there was a violent earthquake. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat there upon it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. And the guards, the Roman guard that had been placed on the tomb to make sure that nothing funny business took place, the guards were so afraid of him that they shook. And they became like dead men. And the angel said to the Lord, "Do not be afraid." Or, as I've told you before, it's an imperative form, so it's easily translated this way: stop being afraid. For I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. And then go quickly and tell his disciples, he's risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. And now, I've told you, I've done my job. I've delivered the message. Listen to it. Verse 8. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." And while the women were on their way, Matthew kind of jumps ahead a little bit in the story. While they were on their way, some of the guards, Roman tough soldiers, elite troops at that point, shock troops designed to keep everything according to Hoyle at that point, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders, they devised a plan. And they gave the disciples a large sum of money, telling them, "Now listen, this is what we're going to do. You are to say that the disciples came during the night and stole him away while you were asleep. And if that report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him. We'll got your back, Jack. We'll take care of it. We'll make sure that you don't get in trouble for this." You see, those Roman guards were on pain of death told to guard that tomb, to prevent exactly what happened from happening. On pain of death, they were to watch that tomb. If this report gets back to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. Verse 15. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Let's think about some of those things this morning. I share with you this Easter morning on the theme, empty. Go back with me now, some 2,000 years roughly, to that particular morning, and we will see, and we will hear, and we will think, and we will feel, and we will experience for ourselves, then and now, what Easter is all about. On the third day, after Jesus was put to death on the cross and laid in his tomb, some of his closest friends discovered that the tomb was empty and that Jesus wasn't dead after all, but alive. These same people at first tell us that they simply didn't know what to make of all of this. They were confused, they were frustrated. They're still living in the afterthroes of what had taken place just a couple days before. They didn't know quite what to make of it all. They were thrilled on the one hand to learn that Jesus was alive again, and yet their happiness was tempered initially by a healthy dose of uncertainty. Could it really be true? The pieces don't jive. They don't fit together. They don't work. But could it really be true? Is it really you, Jesus? You're different, but you're definitely Jesus. Suffice it to say, on that first Easter morning, that as a whole, the world woke up that morning with bleary eyes and foggy brains, and it took a while to absorb the reality of what had taken place. A reality that until that first Easter morning was beyond imagination. You know, the world around us this morning, in the last couple of weeks, I've been rereading and listening and watching around the park where we've been for the last 3 months. There was Easter preparations going on, and they're gathered there this morning at Nettles Island Church for that. But I stopped one morning, and after I was done playing horseshoes, I was sitting there listening to 40, 50 guys talking, and some of them were talking about the coming Easter week. And so I decided I would just sit there, try to sit there very quietly and just absorb what was going on. Some of them I knew were committed Christian believers, and they were talking with joy in anticipation of what was coming. A couple, 2 or 3 of them I know are still struggling and still working with that, and they had questions. And I thought, you know how much that is like what goes on in the world around us. Though the world still struggles to comprehend, it really does. Still struggles to comprehend this morning what happened at the tomb, and it still can't quite decide what to do with this resurrected Jesus. Consider for a few moments this morning some of the explanations that have been concocted to rationalize the resurrection. I share just 3 or 4 of them with you for what they're worth. The stories about Jesus coming back to life are simply poetic ways to illustrate the natural cycles of life and death and birth and rebirth that happen all the time in nature, the world says. Well, that's a nice thought. But quite frankly, the fact of the matter is that in nature, well, you know it as well as I do, when something dies, it's dead. And it stays dead. Whether it's a bush around your house, or it's a loved one, or it's a cause, or when something dies, it stays dead. What do you do with that? These stories about Easter morning, wonderful though they are, but they're meant to illustrate that each one of us has how shall we put this? Well, each one of us has an immortal soul that cannot be killed, the world says. Well, perhaps that idea comes a little bit closer to the truth, but nowhere in Scripture that I've ever read are we told that we possess an immortal soul of our own No, if you look at the Scriptures carefully, everywhere we're told that our hope in life after death is grounded in God's power. And it's God's loving intention to see to it that death doesn't end us. I know I've told you that before, but it seems appropriate to remind you again. Some of you know, as I've told you, I'm a heart patient, and I've had a couple bouts of that. I guess you could say, in one sense, a number of years ago, my heart was stopped, and I was dead. And then I was brought back when the doctors went through the procedure and restarted the heart. They fixed the plumbing that needed to be fixed at that point. And just a couple of years ago, put the pacemaker in to keep things running like they were supposed to. So I have a bit of a feeling about what death is. And I've watched on the scene as a responder to that point, when I've rolled in on heart cases or traffic accidents or whatever that is, or the hospital setting in a critical care situation. I've seen death, and I understand and what goes on with it. And I know that the emphasis is on what God does in that respect when we are raised back to life, and what God does for us, and what we celebrate this morning. Or, the stories about Jesus coming back to life are just symbolic ways of saying that the memory of who Jesus was kept on living among those who had known him, and the power of that memory is what kept them going, the world says. Well, if that's the case, then why didn't those first witnesses say that and get on with their lives? No. If the first disciples had only been inspired by Jesus' memory, if they'd only been living in the day of yesterday, if only they'd been thinking about what had been the glorious moment of what they had experienced, if only they thought that, Scripture would have said that. And it doesn't. It doesn't. Or the stories about the empty tomb and the missing body that we read, and Matthew picks that up here. The story about the empty tomb and the missing bodies were made up in order to prove that Jesus wasn't really resurrected, but in reality, the disciples snuck in and stole the body and hid it. That's the official story. In fact, that's the official story that Matthew records for us. Those disciples, well, a group of women really, went to the tomb, walked in right in front of the eyes of an armed Roman guard, specifically charged with keeping the scene secure, and took the body, and then they spread a story about it. But tell me, just why would those disciples do such a thing? How could they make up such a story when, as they tell us themselves, and as the Scriptures record for us in a number of places, they didn't really yet understand totally who and what Jesus was doing when he tried to tell them that he would rise again on the third day from the dead? And why would the disciples knowingly, deliberately, specifically create a story of a resurrection, knowing full well that such a story was a lie from the get-go, and that every one of them would ultimately pay for that lie with their own deaths? Let me ask you something. Would you give up your life this morning for something that you knew right from the start was a downright lie? I don't think so. I really don't. So there's something that's not quite right yet in what's going on here. No, that's not the case. You see, the only way to make sense of the events of that first Easter morning is to take it at face value, exactly as the eyewitnesses tell us. Those women went to that tomb that first Sunday morning to complete a job that they couldn't get done before the Sabbath started at sundown on Friday. They went to finish a burial process. They expected to find a dead body. They expected to find a continuation of their sorrow. They fully believed that their relationship with the Lord that they loved and served and knew and walked with and laughed with and cried with was over for good. But something had happened. And the only way they could describe it was to say that Jesus was alive again. Not the memory of him, not the wish dream of him, and not that somebody had taken his place. Jesus was there, fully present in bodily form, and yet having qualities that nobody had yet ever encountered. The same Jesus that they saw hanging on a cross just 3 days before was very much alive again, and it blew their minds. After the shock and the fear and the confusion and the doubt, these first people who had encountered the risen Christ tell us that they were changed completely and forever. In fact, they not so much tell us as they show us. They scattered, but very soon they came back together again. They struggled to understand his teachings and the things that he had said and bring those all back to mind and put them together at that point, the things that he had said to them and showed them. But suddenly they began to comprehend all that he had said. And what had been fuzzy before began to snap into focus, and it began to make sense. You might say a resurrection happened in the lives of those first believers too. And you'd be right. Over the years, as they pondered its meaning and sorted out all of the implications and the ramifications and the consequences, they began to see just what had happened. A series of contradictions. In the crucifixion, evil did its best. Well, worse really. Evil did its best that it could do. But in the resurrection, God overturned what had been done. In the crucifixion, death had won the day. But in the resurrection, God proved that life was stronger than death. In the crucifixion, the world said that Jesus' life was a worthless life, a failure, a flop, a disappointment. But in the resurrection, God vindicated and validated that life. The crucifixion took away Jesus from those that he loved, but the resurrection brought him back, never to be taken away again. The crucifixion was the death of a dream, the death of a hope. But the resurrection brought all of that back to life again and gave the disciples a new power that would be with them for the rest of their lives and beyond. I find it kind of interesting as I think about it. Let me share with you some of my weird thinking at that point. I find it kind of interesting that the world never seems to question the fact of the crucifixion. There's plenty of pieces of secular history that document that some character named Jesus was alive in the first century in Palestine at that point and was nailed to a Roman cross and underwent crucifixion. Never have I come across a skeptic or read of reading someone trying to disprove or to explain away the idea that Jesus died on a cross. Why is that? Maybe it's because the the world as you and I know it, then and this morning, is full of death and full of crucifixion. What's going on in eastern part of Europe? What's going on in parts of the Far East? What's going on in the Pacific? There's death and destruction and chaos each and every day, even yet this morning. Have you listened to the news this morning? I haven't yet, but I know what it's going to say. I know what it's going to say. For a time, evil thought it had won, but death had prevailed, that all was lost, but God had other plans. And here's the first point. Roger, can I get you to put that first slide up? For resurrection transforms crucifixion. Just that three-word phrase. Resurrection transforms, changes, focuses on crucifixion. Evil won, but God had other plans. Death prevailed, but God had other plans. All was lost, but God had other plans. I believe this morning, folks, with all of my heart, that death and crucifixion are in our lives still. Like I said, have you read the paper? Did you look at the news last night? But when we come to the tomb, when we come to the tomb and find the stone rolled away, or when we open a door to a breathless and wide-eyed Mary standing there sputtering something about angels and earthquakes, or when we hear some preacher stand and say, Christ is risen, the question is, are we willing to believe and to live by the fact that there's a resurrection in our lives too? Are we? Think of it this way. You and I, this morning, we encounter death and crucifixion every day in some way or form. Every day, because there's a resurrection in our lives. Because there's a resurrection in our lives, we refuse to believe in its power. We know that God has other plans. Death intrudes upon your world and takes away someone you love. But as a person of the resurrection, you can draw unconquerable strength from the knowledge that God desires for your loved one to be with him forever. You try to live your life in a way that Jesus lived his life. You try to live life like you should, and you're frustrated at every turn by those who seem to follow the ways of the world around us, and they seem to be getting ahead. But because of the resurrection in your life, you stick to the straight and narrow path, knowing that in the end, God will honor your devotion. You can commit your life entirely to Christ and then be racked with doubt that what you've done is the right thing. When you start second-guessing yourself and be confronted with dozens of other options that seem more reasonable than the path you've chosen, or be shaken with confusion to the very core of your life when you try to live to those standards and you fail to live the life like you should, and you really know what's going on. But the people with resurrection in their lives, folks like you folks this morning, will find that in the end, if their faith has been real faith, God won't forsake them. Let me say it again. Put the second slide up there, Roger, will you? Resurrection transforms crucifixion. Resurrection transforms life. Life. Let me tell you a story this morning to pull it together. Henry Pritchard. Does that name ring a bell with anybody? He's gone now. It's been a number of years ago. He was an Episcopal priest who lived in the South and had a large congregation in Atlanta at one time, and then finished out his career in the Washington, D.C., and then the Philadelphia area. But anyway, that's not important. Henry Pritchard tells the following story about how resurrection transformed crucifixion in his life. Once there was a little boy, he says, whose name was Philip. Philip was a special needs child, born with Down's syndrome. He was a pleasant, happy little boy, it seemed, but increasingly aware of the differences that occurred between himself and the other children. As he grew older, Philip went to Sunday school every week. In those days, Pritchard said he was teaching a third grade Sunday school class at a large church in the Atlanta area. And Philip was in that church, as well as a dozen or so other little 8-year-old boys and girls. And Sierra's a little older than 8, so we'd have to kind of put her roughly in that spot. A dozen other 8-year-olds. At first, Philip, with his differences, was not readily accepted as a member of Pritchard's third grade Sunday school class. But Harry Pritchard was a very patient, creative teacher, and he worked hard to create a sense of community among all of the 8-year-olds that were in his class, all the 8-year-old children. They learned and they laughed and they played together and they had a great time. But Pritchard could see it. He wasn't dumb. He knew it. He knew that Philip wasn't not really a part of this group of children. Philip, of course, didn't choose to be different, nor did he want to be different. He just was. And that's the way things were. That year for Easter, Pritchard had a marvelous illustration that he brought into his class. You know those things that I'm dating myself here. You know those things that pantyhose used to come in, the plastic eggs. I think eggs are, I don't think you're laughing. None of, But you remember, you picture that at that point. The thing is, he'd gathered about a dozen or so of those plastic eggs, and he brought them for use on a particular Easter Sunday morning. And the children loved it when he brought things into his class. And they had a grand time. Each child was given a big egg, and then was given the assignment to go outside of church for a few moments and find a symbol of new life. Using the old pantyhose containers, and bring it back to class. Well, they'd mix them all up, and then they would spend some time dealing with it, and they'd begin to explore all of the surprises and the new symbols of life once they gathered them all together. So they did. They did all this, and it was glorious, and it was confusing, and it was wild, and all at the same time. They ran around gathering up their little articles, their little symbols, and they quickly returned to class. And then they put all the eggs in a pile on a table in the middle of the room. And the children all gathered around Pritchard, and they began to look at them. And Pritchard picked up one of the eggs, and he opened it. And there was a flower inside. And all the children, they all oohed and awed. And he opened another, and there was a little butterfly. Beautiful, all the little girls said in unison, all alone, because quite frankly, it's pretty hard to get 8-year-old boys to say beautiful about anything, right? Mr. Pritchard opened another egg, and there was a rock. And the third grader, as third graders will, some of them giggled and some of them, quirked at that point. They said, come, that's crazy. How's a rock supposed to be like new life? But one vivacious little boy, whose egg they were speaking of, spoke up. That's mine, he said. I knew the rest of you would go get flowers and buds and leaves and butterflies and stuff like that. So I went and got a rock because I wanted to be different. And for me, that's new life. Okay. Mr. Pritchard opened the next egg, and there was nothing inside. The other children, as 8-year-olds will, said, "Oh, that's not right. Somebody didn't do it. That's dumb." And about this time, Pritchard felt a gentle tug on his coat sleeve, and he looked down, and there was Philip. "It's mine," said Philip. The other children said, "Philip, you never do anything right. There's nothing there. I did so do it right. I did so. It's empty because the tomb was empty." And suddenly the room was silent. A very deafening silence. And for those of you this morning who don't believe in miracles, let me tell you what happened next. From that moment on, things were different. Philip suddenly became a part of that little group of 8-year-olds. They took him in. They accepted him. He was set free from the tomb of his differentness. Later that same summer, Philip died. His family had known since he was born, knew that he wouldn't live out a full life. Many other things were just plain simply wrong with this tiny little body. It had pieces that just had broken down or weren't right in the first place. And so Philip died of an infection that most normal children would have easily shrugged off. But the infection simply overpowered him. Philip was buried from that church. And on the morning of that funeral, a dozen 8-year-old children and a Sunday school teacher named Pritchard marched right up to the casket in the front of that church, not with flowers, but with an empty egg, an empty, old, discarded holder of pantyhose, and left it with Philip. The world all about us this morning knows nothing. It doesn't know what to believe about the rolled away stone and the empty tomb and the risen Christ. Perhaps it's still blinded a little by the crucifixion as well. But church, Jesus, the resurrected one, invites us this morning to accept with faith like that of a little child that he is once more alive again forever. He invites us to live by the power of his resurrection in our lives, working and hoping and dreaming and loving, transforming and being transformed each and every day. For you see, the truth is, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. And so on behalf of Philip and Jesus, a blessed Easter to you all. Amen.